Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. We got a really interesting listener request coming in for today's
Oh
topic.
yeah, this one is it's a good one.
It's taking a look at racial bias in Nebraska's death penalty system.
Big topic.
Huge topic.
Yeah.
And the listener actually sent over some research from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
Okay.
It's an honors thesis from 2020.
Right.
And, I think it's worth mentioning right off the bat that Nebraska has a kind of a complicated history with capital punishment.
Oh, for sure.
They've abolished it and then reinstated it multiple times.
Right. Yeah, and I think that back and forth really speaks to just how much this issue is not just about, legal technicalities.
Right.
It's really about these big questions of justice.
Mm-hmm.
How we as a society decide who deserves that ultimate punishment.
Absolutely. And I think when you're dealing with something as serious as the death penalty, it does kind of make you wonder,
Right.
is there room for, bias to creep in,
I
even
agree.
if it's unintentional? And we know from, just kind of the national conversation that racial bias in the death penalty is really complex.
For sure.
Some studies point to, a clear pattern, but others, including one that I saw that looked at Nebraska specifically,
Okay.
between 1973 and 1999, didn't find that same kind of connection.
Interesting. So, yeah, so that makes this research you sent over even more interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's looking at more recent cases in Nebraska.
Yeah, between 2005 and 2019.
Okay.
And the researcher here looked at the records of all first-degree murder convictions.
Not just the death penalty ones.
Not just the death penalty ones. They wanted to see if there are any patterns based on the race of the person convicted,
Gotcha.
but also the race of the victim.
Interesting. Okay, so what did they find?
Yeah, let's get into the findings.
Yeah.
What really kind of jumped out at you?
Well, the first thing that's important to note is that the study does have some limitations.
Okay.
There were only 5 death sentences handed down in Nebraska during that whole 15-year period.
Whoa.
So, such a small sample size.
Yeah.
It's hard to make any sweeping generalizations.
Right.
However, even with that in mind, there are a couple observations I think are really worth unpacking.
Okay, I'm all ears.
First, while there's a lot of national data that suggests bias against non-white defendants in death penalty cases,
Right.
this study didn't find a statistically significant link between a person's race and whether or not they received a death sentence in Nebraska.
Okay, so that, on the surface at least, seems like good news for Nebraska, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
But here's where things get a little more complicated.
Oh.
So while the study didn't find a statistically significant correlation between the race of the convicted person and a death sentence,
Okay.
they did observe a connection between cases with white victims and death sentences.
Okay.
Now, again, it wasn't statistically significant because of that small sample
I was
size.
going to say I'm sensing a but coming.
Oh, out of those 5 death sentences,
Mm-hmm.
4 of them involved cases with white victims. And this is despite the fact that the overall data set had an almost even split between white and non-white victims.
Okay, so even though the numbers don't scream bias because of that small sample size, the fact that 80% of the people on death row in Nebraska during this time were convicted of killing a white person,
Right.
that has to make you stop and think, right?
It does, absolutely. It raises the question, is there something else going on here?
Yeah.
Could there be these more subtle forms of bias at play that this study just wasn't able to capture
Right.
because of the limited data?
Yeah, I guess that's where this whole idea of systemic bias comes in, right?
Exactly.
Because even if no one is intentionally discriminating,
Mhm.
there could be these factors that are embedded in the system itself
Right.
that lead to these kinds of disparities.
Yeah, think about it this way. The study only looked at the final outcome,
Right.
whether or not someone received the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
But what about all those decisions that happen before you even get to that point? Things like jury selection, plea bargains, even the resources available to different descendants.
Yeah,
All of those things can be influenced by systemic factors.
for sure.
And those influences can have a real impact on the outcome of a case.
So you're saying we need to look beyond just the numbers
Yes.
and consider the context, the processes, the whole picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why the author of this thesis actually recommended that future research should look not just at who gets sentenced to death,
Okay.
but also at who gets considered for the death penalty in the first place.
Interesting.
In other words, they want to examine prosecutorial discretion,
Okay.
those decisions made early on about whether or not to even seek a death sentence.
Now that's an area where implicit bias could really be a factor, right?
Absolutely.
Because those prosecutorial decisions aren't always based on hard data.
Yep.
There's a lot of judgment
A
involved.
lot of judgment.
Yeah.
And that's where things get really tricky.
Yeah.
How do you measure something like implicit bias?
That-
How do you quantify those unconscious assumptions that might be shaping a prosecutor's decision-making process?
Which brings us back to our listener and
Yeah.
what all of this means for them. They
Right.
sent in this research because they're trying to understand this issue.
Exactly.
What do we want them to take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that this is a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay.
Nebraska's death penalty data is limited, but it does raise some important questions.
And the second takeaway.
Don't just focus on the numbers.
Okay.
We have to be willing to look beyond the statistics and consider that broader context, the human element,
Yeah.
the potential for bias to show up in ways that are harder to measure.
Okay, so what does this all mean for our listener who's trying to get a handle on this issue?
Yeah.
We've got some data from Nebraska that doesn't show a clear statistical link between race and the death penalty.
Right.
But there are these little things that make you wonder.
Right? It's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that one study doesn't definitively prove or disprove anything,
Right.
especially with a small sample size like we've got here.
For sure.
Nebraska's death penalty data is complex, and we need more research, particularly research that delves into those less quantifiable aspects of the system.
So it's not just about whether a statistical pattern is proven.
Right.
It's about looking at the whole picture,
Yes.
including the fact that in Nebraska, 80% of the people actually sentenced to death during this period were convicted of killing a white victim.
Right.
That's got to give you pause, right?
It should. Because even if a statistical pattern isn't definitively proven, that kind of disparity raises serious questions
Yeah.
about whether on some level race is playing a role in who ends up on death row.
Yeah. It's definitely a lot to think about. And it seems like the more we dig into this, the more questions we uncover.
That's the nature of these complex systems. You know, you
Yeah.
pull on one thread and suddenly you've got this whole web of interconnected issues. But that's also what makes these deep dives so valuable, right? It helps us see those connections,
For sure.
those nuances that we might otherwise miss.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, is there a final thought, a nugget of wisdom you want to leave our listener with
Oh, sure.
as they continue to explore this topic?
I think the key takeaway here is that understanding bias, especially in a system as complex as the criminal justice system, requires a multifaceted approach.
Yeah.
We can't just rely on statistics.
Right.
Though they are an important piece of the puzzle, we also have to be willing to grapple with those less quantifiable aspects of the system,
Yeah.
to examine the historical context, to consider the potential impact of those less obvious systemic factors.
Well said. And for our listener, I'd add this. Don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Oh, yeah.
Keep learning, keep digging, and keep pushing for a system that is truly just and equitable for everyone.
Couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into racial bias and the death penalty in Nebraska. It's been a challenging but important conversation.
Absolutely. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here.
Right.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more just world.